The company vanished. How did this happen? A 2005 leveraged buyout loaded Toys R Us with roughly $5 billion in debt and roughly $400 million a year in interest. That single decision turned future investment into an obligaton and left the business with no room to fight a faster, cheaper competitor. Toys R Us began as a post-war distribution success. It grew from a catalog and several outlets into a national chain. Geoffrey the Giraffe became a familiar face. By the 1990s, the company was a destination. Fact: it dominated aisle space, negotiated shelf placement, and anchored shopping centers across the country. Consequence: scale created expectations. Towns counted on seasonal traffic. Manufacturers timed launches to a Toys R Us order calendar. Human impact. Longtime store employees describe holiday rituals. Parents remember annual pilgrimages. For many children, a trip to the store was a rite of passage. Then came the deal. Fact: in 2005, a group of private equity firms completed a leveraged buyout that transferred ownership and loaded the corporate balance sheet with debt. The buyers were private equity firms. Consequence: the company's cash flow now had a fixed, large outflow, interest payments and fees that could not be waived without default. Human impact. At town hall meetings and in executive offices, managers had to justify trade-offs between routine store expenses and meeting debt obligations. Former executives recount tense discussions about whether to buy inventory, upgrade point-of-sale systems, or pay investors. For a while, momentum protected the appearance of health. Fact: sales numbers and seasonal crowds continued for several years. The stores remained familiar destinations. Consequence: those surface metrics masked a structural shift. Dividends, transaction fees, and interest obligations drained funds that otherwise would have gone to stores and digital platforms. Human impact. Store managers were told to do more with less. Suppliers noticed slower payments. Long-tenured buyers learned that their purchase orders now competed with debt payments on a weekly cash flow schedule. E-commerce then accelerated. Fact: online retailers invested heavily in logistics and algorithms. The cost structure of pure-play platforms allowed lower prices and faster delivery. Consequence: market share for in-store specialists began to erode. Price matching and loyalty programs became harder to sustain when interest payments claimed a large portion of free cash flow. Human impact. Parents increasingly clicked rather than lined up. Seasonal hiring patterns shifted. Frontline employees reported falling foot traffic and shorter holiday shifts. Small losses arrived first. Fact: a couple of weak holiday seasons reduced inventory turns. Consequence: reduced cash available for reinvestment. Human impact. Overtime hours shrank. Seasonal hires were cut. The next losses were bigger. Fact: credit ratings declined and lending terms tightened. Consequence: new borrowing cost more, and lenders imposed stricter covenants. Human impact. Executives faced stark choices about which stores to refresh and which to leave aging. Suppliers felt pressure as payment cycles stretched. The stakes rose. Fact: planned investments in e-commerce platforms and supply chain modernization were deferred or scaled back. Consequence: online sales share slipped while competitors sped up. Human impact. Small toy makers reported delayed checks and lost orders. Major chains with lighter balance sheets built faster warehouses and cheaper shipping options. The competitive gap widened. Then the crisis intensified. Fact: debt covenants tightened and creditor patience thinned. By 2017, the company filed for Chapter 11 protection. Consequence: the business entered a court process that limited normal operational flexibility and accelerated decision-making under creditor oversight. Human impact. Store managers and district leaders learned of potential closures. Employees faced uncertainty as holiday hiring plans were put on hold. At each step, the scale of the problem increased. Early shortfalls were readable as cycles. Later shortfalls hit the capital structure itself. Fact: interest is non-discretionary. Every quarter, lenders must be paid before discretionary projects. Consequence: with $400 million in annual interest commitments, choices about technology, logistics, and inventory were decided by the balance due on the debt statement long before marketing plans or product roadmaps were set. Human impact: teams that wanted to pilot a new website, test same-day fulfillment, or remodel stores were told to postpone. Those postponements became permanent. Throughout this decline, the company's public face kept some momentum. Fact: management still sought to promote store events and exclusive product launches. Consequence: those public bets used scarce cash and deferred necessary capital projects. Human impact: regional managers describe being celebrated for short-term traffic increases while told not to spend on long-term store infrastructure. The debt mechanics must be clear. Fact: interest payments are a first lien on cash flow. Consequence: when a large portion of EBITDA is allocated to interest, fewer dollars remain for capital expenditures, inventory investment, and digital transformation. Human impact: executives used the phrase "do more with less" in employee meetings. Former buyers said they juggled delayed invoices and shrinking promotion budgets. As pressure rose, options narrowed. Fact: lenders pressed for repayment or restructuring. Consequence: potential buyers and turnaround investors balked at a balance sheet that left little upside. Offers that could preserve the entire chain required capital injections that were not forthcoming. Human impact: town halls shifted from planning to damage control. Employees packed boxes. Longtime suppliers tightened lines of credit or cut off shipments. Halfway through this story, stay with this story. After the Chapter 11 filing, the choices became binary. Fact: the court process forced a reckoning over whether to restructure the national chain or liquidate assets. Consequence: management and advisors concluded that the debt burden made a viable standalone plan implausible without massive new capital. Human impact: thousands of employees were laid off within weeks. Store closures accelerated, communities lost an anchor tenant, and seasonal employment vanished. The collapse was decisive. Fact: stores closed, leases were surrendered or sold, and brand assets were auctioned. Consequence: the physical network that had supported a broad supplier ecosystem dissolved. Long-term manufacturing relationships lost a major purchaser. Human impact: families mourned the loss of a retail ritual. Store employees described the last day, ringing registers, packing up mascots, and handing out goodbye notes. The financial trail left forensic markers. Fact: over more than a decade, roughly $400 million a year in interest-diverted funds that might otherwise have been used to invest in online platforms and distribution centers. Consequence: the company could not match the speed and convenience of competitors without sacrificing debt servicing. Human impact: innovation teams that proposed warehouse automation or a re-platforming of e-commerce were repeatedly told those projects would need to wait. To understand the mechanics, imagine a cash waterfall. Fact: revenue becomes gross profit, then covers operating expenses, then taxes, and then interest and principal. Consequence: with a large fixed interest outflow, the amount that reaches discretionary buckets, capital expenditure, store remodels, marketing, shrinks. Human impact: buyers who once planned product rollouts for spring and fall found their purchase orders curtailed because cash was reserved for debt payments. A lightly levered retailer has options. Fact: with modest debt, a retailer can borrow to fund a new distribution center or take temporary losses to defend market share. Consequence: that borrowing preserves competitive options. Human impact: employees in those retailers receive training and investment that sustains jobs over cycles. A highly leveraged retailer does not have that luxury. Fact: every downturn magnifies fixed obligations. Consequence: what begins as a temporary revenue dip becomes a solvency risk. Human impact: Millions of annual hours of work evaporate as stores close. The decision to accept the 2005 deal had ripple effects. Fact: private equity owners prioritized returns that typical buyers seek through leverage and operational changes. Consequence: capital that would have funded long-term structural investments was redirected. Human impact: regional teams felt the tension between delivering quarterly sales and investing for an unknown digital future. Regulatory or legal history played a limited role in the collapse. Fact: there were no prior regulatory bans that forced a change in business model. Consequence: the cause is financial and operational, not regulatory. Human impact: stakeholders focused on capital structure as the decisive variable. The sell-off of assets followed predictable financial math. Fact: in liquidation, brand names, trademarks, and inventory are divided and sold. Consequence: creditors recover a fraction of claims. Human impact: small toy manufacturers who relied on a single large buyer saw revenues collapse and payrolls shrink. The public and industry response focused on lessons. Fact: forensic accounting after the liquidation traced large interest drains and owner distributions over the years. Consequence: investors and managers reassessed how leverage magnifies retail risk. Human impact: former employees and managers shifted careers, reskilling into logistics, online retail, or leaving retail entirely. Every escalation in this story was worse than the previous. Weak seasons led to tighter covenants. Tighter covenants reduced borrowing flexibility. Reduced borrowing flexibility stopped necessary investments. Stopping investments accelerated market share loss. Market share loss tightened cash flow further. Fact: the escalation was cumulative and self-reinforcing. Consequence: the chain of cause and effect left few rescue options. Human impact: entire local economies saw reduced foot traffic where Toys R Us had anchored malls and shopping districts. Throughout, concrete numbers matter. Fact: $5 billion of debt and roughly $400 million of annual interest were a structural drag. Consequence: those outflows matched or exceeded plausible budgets for company-wide digital transformation and substantial supply chain upgrades. Human impact: IT teams watched planned overhauls deferred while service-level agreements slipped. Who chose this path? Fact: owners and boards have fiduciary responsibilities and financial agendas. Consequence: when ownership structures change, strategic priorities change too. Human impact: employees who had joined under one set of expectations found their roles redefined under another. When lenders finally demanded immediate action, the options were stark. Fact: buyers who considered preserving the chain factored in the debt burden. Consequence: offers that could have saved many stores required capital that was not presented. Human impact: communities that had scheduled events around the chain were left scrambling to fill retail space and seasonal positions. Institutional fallout followed. Fact: pensions, suppliers, and unsecured creditors absorbed losses. Consequence: the toy industry consolidated. Human impact: small manufacturers and specialty designers lost a major national channel and faced reduced distribution choices. The long-term industry effects are now part of retail case studies. Fact: the Toys R Us lifecycle entered manuals on capital structure risk. Consequence: boards, lenders, and private equity firms reconsider leverage levels in retail deals. Human impact: managers use this episode to argue for preserving investment capacity during acquisitions. In the final days, the human toll sharpened the message. Fact: stores closed and signs announced liquidation sales. Consequence: merchandise discounts could not make up for structural collapse. Human impact: the last cashiers counted down the final sales. Former store leaders described customers who came to buy a last toy and left with a memory. After the liquidation, some brand elements survived in new forms. Fact: trademarks and digital assets were acquired and repurposed. Consequence: The Toys R Us name returned in limited formats rather than a nationwide chain. Human impact. A few employees found new roles with successor ventures, while many others had to retrain. The forensic conclusion is plain. Fact. High leverage turned interest payments into a stranglehold. Consequence. The company could not fund the investments required to compete in a changed retail landscape. Human impact. Thousands of livelihoods ended. A retail ritual evaporated, and local economies felt the vacancy. When a beloved company sells its future for today's payouts, who pays the price? Learn the warning signs.